All right. Well, good evening, Orlando. How you guys doing tonight? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me out here at the 30th Orlando Nerd Night. Like Ricardo said, my name is Mike McConville. I run the planetarium over at Seminole State College, and I am a professor of history over at the University of Central Florida. So I run double duty here in Central Florida, and it's oftentimes, we lose sight of the fact that science and history often run together. And so tonight, we get to talk about Mayan astronomy. The Maya are extremely famous. Probably a lot more so in 2012 when they had that apocalypse that didn't happen. They've got a calendar that is incredibly accurate across 5,100 years. But their astronomy, for a civilization that's about 1,000 years old, was one of the most advanced in the entire world. And so the things that our European ancestors were learning about, the Mayans were taking care of all the way back about 1,000 years ago. And so tonight we get to talk a little bit about the amazing insight of the Mayan people. Now before we begin, there is one reason why we keep the background picture up there. That is an infrared shot from the Spitzer Space Telescope. And it's of a very important star-forming region in the constellation of Orion the Hunter. It's actually the Orion Nebula. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple of slides. But it is all about creation with the Mayans. For them, life was a cycle of death and rebirth, death and rebirth. And so an apocalypse wouldn't mean the end of the world, it would just mean the end of this world and the beginning of a brand new one. So we'll talk about that one in a little bit. But to know about the Mayans' astronomical leanings, you got to know a little bit about the people and where they came from. And for us, that means we've got to go to the Yucatan. Of course, that puts us right here in Central America, what today would be Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and northern Honduras. Today, there's still about 2 million indigenous Maya still living in Mexico and Central America. But about 1,000 years ago, we had the heyday of the Mayan people. And so as we move in towards the Yucatan, two of the major cities that we had emerge about 1,000 years ago were Chichen Itza in the north and Tikal in the south. Chichen Itza, one of the most famous tourist locations in all of Mexico. Tikal is the most studied Mayan city, except it's 180 miles from the closest big airport, and not many people get to go out there. I was fortunate a couple of years ago to actually go out to Tikal and do some research on my own in the city. It is absolutely breathtaking. It's got more tall pyramids than any other Western Hemisphere city. And more importantly, if you are a fan of Star Wars, and I'm assuming, kind of given the demographics of this crowd, you probably are. If you remember back to the original Star Wars, A New Hope, there was a rebel base on Yavin 4. And it is peeking out over the canopy. That is actually shot from Temple 4, the tallest temple in Tikal. It was one of George Lucas's most important locations in filming the trilogy. And so it goes back quite a way. And of course, kind of given that this is Nerd Night, it's kind of important, and Ricardo's probably going to kill me for smuggling it in. But I do have a beer, and so we're going to devote tonight... We're going to devote tonight to the Mayan god of drinking and drunkenness and revelry. It's known as a cob. And so just raise a glass to a cob tonight as we talk about the Mayans. But this is the main acropolis of Tikal. It's one of the major areas in the middle of the city. And it is an area like Chichen Itza that was extremely large for 1,000 years ago. These were cities with populations of almost 100,000, which means that there would be about the same population density as New Jersey. These are big, big cities, about the size of Sanford today. And they're out in the middle of the forest. And they had almost no use for the wheel. And yet, their astronomical observations were the most accurate of anyone in the world until the 1600s. So this is a pretty impressive group of people. And so what we'll do is start off with their kind of understanding of the world around them, their universe. And so for us, it comes down to what's known as the fire of creation. And so for our space guys out there, what constellation do we have up there on the screen? Orion. That is Orion. And there are three very, very important stars in Orion for the Mayans. In the lower right is the star Rigel. In the lower left is the star Scythe. And in the middle of the belt is a star known as Alnilam. It is the single brightest star in Orion. If we were to equalize all their distances, it's about 300,000 times brighter than the sun. And these three stars make up a triangle. For the Mayans, their creation story was of the hero twins, Xbalanque and Hunahpu, who go to the underworld, Xibalba, to save their father. He's been killed by the lords of death. They want to take back his body and resuscitate him. They want to bring him back to life. And so they defeat the lords of death, get his body, and take him to Middle World, what we know as Earth. And they put his body in between 3 hearthstones and made a fire in the center. And in the center of this triangle is the fire of creation. They had no idea what it was. We now know that it's a nebula, the Orion Nebula. It's an area of gas and dust where new stars are being born. And so the Mayans, a little bit ahead of their time, one of the great coincidences of Mayan astronomy, figure out that the creation fire for them is actually a place where more stars are being born than just about any other place in the Milky Way galaxy. So we've got a really, really impressive start to all of this. And in this fire creation leapt forth not their father, but a new god, the maize god. If you're in Central America, you don't worry about the comings and goings of winter and summer. There are no seasons. It's rainy, and then there's a dry season. You can grow all the time. And the number one food staple would have been corn. To them, the maize god rising from the fire of creation would mark the entirety of their cosmology. And like many of the other ancient civilizations, the Mayan astronomical views are very closely tied to their mythology. And so, to them, and throughout Central America and the Caribbean, there are very, very large trees with white bark. They're known as ceiba trees. They have massive root systems, very, very thin, tall trunks, and huge canopies. To the Mayans, these were the huacachans, the world trees. Their roots deep down in the underworld of Xibalba. The trunk would go through the middle world, and the canopy would stretch out into the heavens, through the first 7 layers of the heavens, until it reached paradise. And in this tree, all of existence could be known. But to them, it was more than just a tree. It wasn't just an earthly thing. It's something that could be connected to the sky itself. And so for the Mayans, as they try to develop this universal view, the conquistadors show up. We don't have to talk long and hard about the Spanish coming over, deciding that there's a white tree that often looks like a cross. And then they ask them, is that a Christian cross? Do you believe in Jesus? And they're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. And the Spanish decide to burn about 95% of all the Mayan writings. So we have that going for us. We have very little to work with, except for a series of writings known as the codices. This one in particular is the Dresden Codex. It was brought over to Dresden in Germany, and it was analyzed in the early part of the 20th century. It is 45 pages, almost entirely having to do with astronomy. It is the single oldest written document in the Western Hemisphere. And in it, we have the entirety of what the Mayans believed about the sky. We got an idea about their calendar, their idea about the planets. They cared not for the comings and goings of seasons. They liked things that moved and were bright. The sun, the moon, and the planets. So to them, the sky was just as important to their life as the ground, as the corn, as the people, as a game known as Pocahontas, the Mayan ball game. Little aside there, the Mayan ball game was about as dangerous as you could ever play. You played in a court about the size of a basketball court. There's a little ring up on both side walls. The ring's about 1 foot across. You have a ball that's about 10 inches across. It's made of hard rubber, and your job is to get that ball through the hole without it touching the ground. Except you can only use your knees, your hips, and your shoulders. If you lose, you get sacrificed. They behead you and roll you down the steps of the temple. So, it's kind of a one-and-done sort of thing. If you're on your 5th game, you're pretty much the Michael Jordan of Pocahontas. So it works out pretty well. But the Dresden Codex gives us all of these ideas about what's going on in Mayan cosmology. And at the center of Mayan astronomy is the sun and the moon. We have what are known as steles, these massive stone monuments that were inscribed with the stories of the Mayan people. And in them, the 2 most prominent members of the mythology are Xbalanque and Hunahpu. Hunahpu is going to be the sun god, there in yellow. And then you have Xbalanque, who is the moon god, in blue. These 2 defeat the Lord of Death, rise through the heavens, and are made into the sun and the moon. They are the cycle of rebirth and death, over and over and over again. And so the coming of the sun, the rising of the moon, very, very important for these people. But they also were very, very aware of what happened when one of them disappeared. Eclipses were incredibly important to the Maya, because if the moon were to turn blood red, perhaps the gods were angry. If the sun were to disappear, well, they've got to make sure to do all the sacrifices to make sure that pandemonium and anarchy doesn't show up in the society. And so 1,500 years before Europe figures out how to do it, the Mayans are able to predict lunar and solar eclipses down to an accuracy of 2 hours, which is really quite impressive. Additionally, the Mayans understood the interplay between astronomy and everyday life. One of their major gods and goddesses was known as Ixchel. Ixchel was the goddess of fertility and the moon and the night, because they realized that women tended to go through a cycle that lasted about 28 to 30 days, which just so happened to correspond with the cycle of the moon phases. And so they came to believe that the moon controlled women's lives and that the sun controlled men's lives. Of course, we know that a little bit differently now, but they have an understanding that there's some sort of connection between all of this. And to the Mayans, more than anything else, their understanding of the world came from the fact that it was really, really dark back then. There were no lights. You can walk out here from the Science Center and not see much of anything. You go to the Yucatan to Central America, way back 1,000 years, and it's pitch black. You can see everything. And so for them, in the summer, they would see the Milky Way arching across the sky. They would see this as the world tree. You can see the Yucatan connecting across. And at the very top was an animal known as the Itzimye, the celestial bird, who could see all things. This celestial bird would stretch from south to north as the Milky Way passed directly overhead in the middle of August. The Itzimye was kind of powerful. Sorcery, magic was its forte. And the Itzimye knew all things of all realms of existence. But in the wintertime, it told a different story. The Milky Way told the story of the crocodile canoe. It was the dugout canoe that Xbalanque and Hunahpu would use to cross the celestial river, to defeat the lords of death. And so they would look to the sky and see the Milky Way arching from west to east. For them, the sky was a direct connection to their lives. And so, in the sky, there is one really, really important object for our friends the Maya, and it's Venus. The brightest of all the planets, the fastest of the movers that at least they could see, and they connected it to a god named Kukulkan. In the Aztec mythology, it's known as Quetzalcoatl. So important that we named a dinosaur after it. Quetzalcoatlus, the largest flying dinosaur on record, 38 feet across. It's huge. And so this feathered serpent becomes the center of Mayan astronomy. Venus is something they spent a whole lot of time talking about. They'd put it everywhere. They'd put it on the side of their temples, and they would watch Venus day after day, night after night, month after month, and come up with an absolutely amazing view of the universe. So amazing, in fact, that they would build an entire temple to it. This is El Castillo in the town of Chichen Itza. El Castillo is about 380 feet tall. It's one of the tallest pyramids in the entire world. And every equinox, in March and in September, the steps here along the side, which number, precisely 365, it's kind of an important number, will actually illuminate an area along the edge that looks like the scalloped back of a flying serpent. It happens twice a year on two very, very important days. But they also were able to figure out something that scientists were not aware of until the 20th century. And it's the fact that both Earth and Venus share what we call an orbital resonance. For every 13 of Venus's orbits, the Earth makes precisely 8 of them. And when you plot that out, it looks a little something like, we'll see that in a second. Here's the reason why. You've got the sun, you have Venus, and you have Earth. We call these conjunctions. It happens when the Venus is either on one side of the sun or the other. At superior conjunction, on the opposite side of the sun, it becomes the evening star. But move it to the middle. In between the Earth and the sun, it becomes the morning star. And these conjunctions were able to be mapped by the Mayans. Altogether, we have a map that looks like this. That is 8 years of Earth and Venus orbits. That is an actual movement map of Earth and Venus together. The Mayans were able to discern this 1,500 years ago in a jungle, and we couldn't figure it out mathematically until the early 1900s. So the Mayans very, very advanced when it came to those sorts of things. And so we had to ask, how is it possible that the Mayans, in the middle of the jungle, with no use for the wheel, come up with a cosmology, a view of the universe so impressive? And it's because they were really ahead of their time as well. They built observatories. And so these observatories, hopefully, there we go. Let's move forward. One more time. We'll see how this works. So, that's an observatory. This is El Caracal, the snail. It's in Chichen Itza. It is an observatory unlike any in the world. It looks a lot like the ones we have today. There's no telescope in the middle. It's actually a staircase. The staircase goes up to 4 different levels with windows on each of them. And as you move forward and up towards the top of the Caracal, all of these windows begin to line up. And so scientists, astronomers, and archaeologists have been able to determine that there are at least a dozen different alignments between the windows in the Caracal, telling you the rising and settings of very, very important stars. You can see Pollux and Castor of Gemini. It tells you where the sunrise will happen on the summer and winter solstices, on the equinoxes, allowing you to set up your calendar so precisely that over the course of the entire Mayan calendar, the 5,000 years of the long count, it is only off by 45 minutes. They did this with stone. And so if you're going to put your equations down, this is why nobody at UCF in calculus is using pen. The last thing you want to do is go, damn it, and then have to take the whole thing out. Here they're putting it in stone, and all they come up with is a calendar that's off by 45 minutes over the course of 5,000 years. It's pretty good. And so the astronomy altogether of the Mayans, really, really amazing. I mean, the calendar's great, but that astronomy is far, far more impressive. And it's something that we still use today. A lot of the observations of the Mayans are still being used by astronomers around the world at this very moment. And so that, in all of 15 minutes, is the entirety of Mayan astronomy. So thank you guys for having me out. Ricardo, thanks so much.